Don't any of you have the guts to play for blood?
I'm your huckleberry. That's just my game.
Welcome back to MythVision. Today, I have the honor of being joined by Dr. or Professor Markus Vinzent. Welcome to MythVision.
Well, Derek, thanks so much for inviting me back to your channel.
Well, there's much more to talk about. And just for the viewers to know, he's one of the world's foremost scholars of early Christianity and patristics. He's here to discuss his groundbreaking new book. It's not been released yet, From Paul to Saul, a work that re-examines the Apostle Paul, his letters, and the making of the New Testament. This ambitious project was co-authored with Drs. Jack Bull, Mark G. Bilby, and Kevin Lance Lotharp. Together, these scholars have pulled back the curtain on the earliest Pauline collections, especially the 10-letter collection associated with Marcion, and shown how the later 14-letter collection reshaped Paul into the Solus Paul of the canonical tradition. While I'm joined today by Professor Vinzent alone, I want to acknowledge the entire team behind this important volume. And for those who want even more cutting-edge scholarship on early church, I highly recommend subscribing to their YouTube channel, Patristica, where these voices share deep insights into the history of Christianity. Again, welcome, Dr. Vinzent. You are on Amazon, several publications. Your book will be out on Amazon when the time comes. Let me know. I'll insert the link in the description, and we should do a follow-up episode covering this as well. You also have the blog, so I hope everybody goes checks out the blog, markusvincent.blogspot.com. You have the academia page. Be sure to follow him there. You can read articles for free all day long. And then the Patristica YouTube channel, which is like you, Jack Bull, and Mark Bilby, really doing all sorts of amazing material. And anyway, I don't want to hog the space too long, but I do want to say this. I came across an article that was done with Mark Bilby on Orestes in Acts, and I was freaking blown away. He actually emailed about it, and I looked at the link, and I went and read it myself, and I thought, wow, I think he's onto something. This is brilliant. He really, I think, puts it into perspective, builds upon McDonald's work, if that makes sense. So anyway, welcome back to MythVision.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for the intro. I mean, it's always lovely to speak to you because you know so much, and I think your readers or those who listen to us, they're really engaging.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a really smart audience, a lot of thinkers who love what you're putting out. Of course, scholars like you is what I'm aiming for. And so let me not waste any more time with this book. It's unfortunate it's not out yet, which we would be just plugging away. But don't worry, I promise you we're going to do a follow-up episode covering this in greater depth. So the first thing
is the German version. But that will come out in English.
Yes, we need it in English, but then again, you might know German. Be sure to get the book. I wanted to start with, especially with like the recent interviews I've done with Nina Livesey and, seeing how she sees Acts and stuff. We're going to get into some of this, but what inspired you to title the book From Paul to Saul? What shift are you capturing in that phrase?
One of the major shifts is just to link with the interview you just had before me here, where it was about New Testament manuscripts. Maybe you show the book again.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great book. So words are not enough, because when you let's say when you get to the New Testament in forms of manuscripts, then you have over 800 manuscripts on Paul's letters, for example. Yeah, we have over 1,000 overall for the New Testament. Yet the majority of these manuscripts give us pretty much the same order of our books as we have them. And they're quite different from the New Testaments as you have them in your hands today. So this might already be a question. Why don't we have it the way they have it in those manuscripts? Because these manuscripts start pretty much as our New Testament with 4 Gospels. Then comes Acts as we have them too. But then, as you know, the Pauline letters follow Acts. And only then come James, Jude later, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1, 2, 3, John, and then Jude at the end somewhere. So Jude has not always a fixed place in the manuscripts. But today we have Acts combined, with the Paul's letters. And only then what we call the Catholic letters before Revelation comes. Yet in those manuscripts, Acts is always bound together, not with Paul, but bound together with those Catholic letters. So with James, Peter's, John's, and Jude, How is that? First observation, right? So we have a different structure. And why is that the case? Because these New Testament editors in the past, in the, let's say, probably end of 2nd century, then in the 3rd century and later, they wanted us to read after the Gospels, not Paul first, and not only Acts first. They wanted us to look like through my glasses. They wanted us to look through Acts, then through the Catholic letters, because those are the 3 apostles: Peter, James, John, or James, Peter, John. Those are the 3 pillars as they are mentioned in Galatians 2. Those are the most foundational apostles, not Paul. Paul is, as in 1 Corinthians 15, called the after apostle, the one who is a bit too late, who hasn't been with Jesus, has never seen him actually as a living person. Hence, they pushed those letters further back. What I'm just saying is the soul which is being created in Acts is a figure of Paul that was so imbued into us through the order of these books in the manuscripts, hence through the history of the church. You only need to look at what kind of pictures do we get when we go to a museum, and we see Paul, the person of Paul in those pictures is the one who is being struck by a light before Damascus. But that's a story which doesn't appear in the letters of Paul. So the picture in our minds, in our hearts, in people's lives is the kind of a soul transformed into a Paul. Now, I turned that upside down because I was interested, probably less than Nina Livesey, in the question, well, can we trust Acts or can we not trust Acts? That's another question. We might come to that a bit later. But I was first interested in the question, what happens if those letters of Paul are being pushed backwards in the New Testament?
Sorry.
No, you can.
No, it's relevant to the question that I actually follow up was that you focus heavily on the 10-letter collection associated with Marcion as the earliest Pauline corpus. I guess a 2-pronged question is, why is it so important to revisit this collection now? And how does the Paul of the 10-letter collection differ from the Paul of the 14-letter canonical corpus?
That's very important. I've started here with Acts and with the order of the books because I wanted to clarify that the 14 letters are already a remote collection of Paul. So we have in the edition of our New Testament, we have several attempts to move away the Pauline letters. The first is by placing Acts together with the Catholic epistles first as a sub-collection in our manuscripts, and to place the 14 letters at the end. A second attempt was to create a collection of 14 letters of Paul. Because what do we have? I mean, where's the difference, for example, between these 14 letters in that collection or in the sub-collection of our New Testament compared to the 10 letters that are credited to Marcion? We have, of course, as the numbers say, 4 more letters in the 14-letter collection. Now, which of these 4 are they? When you take modern scholarship, and let me just take away those more fundamentalist, uncritical New Testament scholars, but let's go with the majority opinion. The majority believes and has long believed, that the 3 so-called pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and the letter to Titus, and the letter of Hebrews are not written by Paul. That's why they call it the pseudo-Paulines.
Right.
Hebrews never claims to be written by Paul, but 2nd and 1st Timothy and Titus do, because they say that these letters are written by Paul to Timothy or Titus. Now, the other 10 letters that are remaining are indeed 10 letters which you will find in Marcion's collection. And now when you compare those 2 collections, you can see that the canonical editors of the canonical New Testament have not only pushed back the letters after Acts and the Catholic letters, they have also added to the 10 letters of Paul 4 more letters. And all of these 4, which they have added, are pseudo-Pauline letters. Now, when you then compare a letter collection where you have 10 letters, which we call Pauline, some people say these are the authentic Pauline letters. If you take very critical scholarship, you say, well, the 7 letters of these 10 are by Paul, and 3 are being called Deutero-Paulines. Deuteros means second, so they are second-hand Pauline texts, not written by Paul himself, but in the close school by pupils of Paul. Mm-hmm. And these are, the Deutero-Paulines are Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. Now, when you compare a collection which has 10, let's say, Pauline and very close to Paul written letters, to a collection which has those 10, plus 4 forged letters, which claim to be by Paul but are pseudo-Paul, you get skeptical at face value. And you think, well, if a collection is it's more than 25% a mixed bag of forged letters and authentic letters, then you have a collection which is purely by Paul or close to Paul. Who's got the better collection? We would think, well, the 10 letters are better than the 14 where you have a mixed bag. And you can see that's where the first doubts start. When you then recognize that the 10 letters in the 10-letter collection are shorter than the letters in the 14 letters collection, you may ask, well, if this collection has more letters which are forged and has longer letters of those 10, are these texts not also added by the same forgers who have forged those 4 letters?
If I made just an observation, and me and Jacob Ehrman have had this conversation on the phone, that is what's more likely. He's been on both sides. Jacob's on a journey like me, and we're just wherever makes the most sense we go. And sometimes he'll be more Marcion school like yours, and then sometimes he'll think, nah, you know what? I think maybe Marcion cut and redacted. And then sometimes he's back on the Marcion side. He's going between these views, right? And we were talking about this very issue about did Marcion really cut or add? They added. And what is statistically, I imagine there's got to be a way to calculate this. I don't know if anyone has ever done this. I know that someone like Mark Bilby would take the task on, and that is, what is more probable, that people are redacting or they are adding materials? And what do you find more often in the ancient world?
I give you an answer which is not a statistical one, but which is a logical one. I think it is sheer impossible that any redactor in the 1st to the 5th century to the 15th century could have extracted and cut off exactly the pseudo-Pauline letters. Sheer impossible. I give you the reasons. These 3 letters, particularly those who carry the name of Paul in the address, have never been questioned for the first 1,000 years. They have been regarded by everybody as being written by Paul. Now, if we were to say that a redactor, say Marcion, cut off exactly the pseudo-Paulines, he would have needed the concordance, he would have needed the tools that New Testament scholars had developed from the late 18th century right through to the 21st century. And if you then think that still today there are minority people who claim that 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus are written by Paul because there are some parallels, there are some likelihoods, there are some stylistics, some topics. How can you, on the basis that Jacob would be right, and he's for a moment a non-Marcionite, how can we explain that an ancient scholar had been able to dissociate, first of all, what is in the 21st century with all our communication, all our research, all our computer data, that we are able to discern what is Pauline, what is Deuteropauline, and what differentiates those corpus elements from the 4 letters? Impossible. He cannot have predated New Testament scholarship. And if he had, what do we do? I mean, what have we done in the last 250 years? It's all nonsense, right? If somebody in the 2nd century could have been able to cut those 4 off. So
that leads into my next question, actually. But please finish that point.
Yeah, I think the only way is if you have like 2 students' works. Here is the original one, highly intelligent. It's logical. It's whatever it is. It makes sense. It has its style. And then you have the plagiarites. And 2 students have copied from it. And you see, in between, there are these Wikipedia elements, which really do not make sense, are contradicting the other texts, I think quite quickly you will establish, which one is the original one, which one is the plagiarism. And here likewise. So the only way, I think, was either these texts had not been written at the time that the 10-letter collection was put together, or if they had been present, it must have been known that these were pseudo-Pauline texts. Otherwise, people couldn't have done it. Origen, for example, or even Tertullian, sometimes dissociates texts by style. So Origen, for example, says, well, Hebrews, the Greek is actually not like in a plagiarism bad. No, the Greek, Origen says, is the best of the entire New Testament. No Paul could have written a text so stylish and so well written in Greek, because all the other letters have a different style. And then he says, maybe Barnabas, one of the students of Paul, may have written that text, or somebody else, he says. So this is the kind of mechanism that worked in the 3rd century. So again, I think give the credit to rather an expansion than a reduction, simply on that basis.
That
But
leads in. Oh,
no, come on.
it leads into that. You note that themes like property, inheritance, slavery, and gender roles play a much larger role in the earlier collection. So I want to ask these kind of two.
We'll come to that. We will come to the content.
Okay,
let me just finish why I also think there are further reasons why I think it's rather growing than being abridgment. First of all, a general observation. In antiquity, things grow, collections rather grow than they're being cut down. And that's one of the ways how a collection really makes its way to the audience. It's a bit like yours. If we were in a 10-minute show, I think you wouldn't have 10% of the people who will listen to you.
Right.
You have to have a certain weight. In your time or in your genre, it's time. Yeah. If you do a show of an hour, great, fantastic. But you have got an audience who can stand with you for 1.5 hours, sometimes for 2 hours, because the attraction is there and there is a weight behind it. Second element, we not only have those 4 pastoral letters which are standing out, we have also these Deuteropaulines, so the second-handed Pauline letters. Now in our New Testament, we can just take any New Testament. Let's take the Greek New Testament. You will see that in the order of our New Testament, you will find that the 3 Deuteropauline letters are not stuck together. In between each, we have one of the 7 so-called authentic Pauline letters. Now, you tell me, how do you think, could it be possible that if Jacob Berman were right, that the Marcion, who abbreviates those 10 letters, pinches those 3 Deuteropaulines and puts them together in one block in his collection? Because in his collection, the 7 Pauline letters are stuck together, with the exception of the 1 letter to Philemon, which comes last. But the 3 Deuteropauline letters are being collated. Again, this chap must have been a New Testament scholar of the 19th, 20th, or 21st century, to have not only the sensibility to cut out 4 pseudo-Pauline letters, but also to have the nose or the eye to dig out the 3 Deuteropaulines, to get them out and stick them together. Again, I tell you, it's on sheer logic and historical reasoning impossible. But it is explicable that somebody who has these 10 letters in that collection in front of him knows about the origin of the 3 letters as a collection, and by reworking it, not only places the 4 new letters towards the end of the collection, but also intersperses the 3 letters, each with what they believed is an authentic letter, so that we get a collection which sounds like a collection that's always been together. And one further element is so interesting. How would you make or give the impression that the 4 forged letters have been original letters? Well, you only need to ask yourself, why are those 3 letters, the pastorals, written to Titus and 2 to Timothy? Titus is explicable. He is the only co-worker of Paul in the 10-letter collection of Marcion. So if you write a forged letter, you better write it to somebody who is known already to the readers.
To connect, yeah.
It makes the connection. But the difficulty is that 2 of those newly forged letters are written to Timothy, and Timothy never ever appears in the 10-letter collection. So what do? Well, you take the canon and you sprinkle Timothy into the old letters. Bingo. Now Timothy in the 14-letter collection appears as a co-writer of letters of Paul. And he is presented as a trustworthy co-worker of Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians 4. So what you get is, when you read the 14 letters in our New Testament, you get an impression that these 14 letters have always belonged together.
It's a fascinating point you bring up, like you call it a historical impossibility, and those are strong words. It's just so, if I were to use terms, right, the way I'd coin is, there's just so much less likely that it just doesn't seem to be, it doesn't make sense on why, for me, that they would just go and just start using a scalpel and trying to cut and scissor out, and then it still makes coherent sense after cutting all of it out. That's why I wanted to shift into this after you were able to explain that, because if you get into the like inheritance, property, slavery, gender roles, interpretations, these are larger roles in the earlier Pauline corpus or the earlier Marcion collection, if you will. How do these social, economic themes reframe our image of Paul? And can you explain how the canonical editors reshaped the 10 letters when expanding to the 14 letters collection? In effect, this also kind of solves like why it makes more sense why this would come after rather than the primitive Paul, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. First of all, I think the big connection between those content-related elements are the connection between Acts and the 14-letter collection. And that's why I called this book From Paul to Saul, because Saul never appears in the 10-letter collection. He doesn't even appear in the canonical 10 or 14 letters. Yeah, it only appears in Acts. Now, in Acts, Paul is a very different Paul. Right from the beginning of Acts, he is not a real apostle, because Acts starts with a re-election because Jude was falling out. So they re-elect a 12th member for the 12 apostles, Matthias. The 12 apostles are representative for Israel, for the tribes of Israel. And here comes your first question with inheritance. Inheritance is utterly important for the canonical redactors. For the canonical New Testament, it is all about inheriting what Israel and what the Jews owned prior to Christianity. And that gives us already a historical setting in that debate. Because in the first, at the end of the first Jewish war, Jews were still present in Jerusalem. They had lost their temple, no doubt, but they were still inhabiting in their homes. They were living there. There were pilgrimage. Celebrations took place. The synagogues functioned, and. Life didn't change much except that the temple was lost. And that, for the first time, changes at the end of the Second Jewish War, because Hadrian started to reconfigure Jerusalem as a Roman city, Aelia Capitolina, and built, instead of the temple, a Swiss statue and a Greek temple. And he drove away every circumcised Jew, in brackets also Christians. So everybody who was circumcised, all male circumcised people, were banned from Jerusalem. And as a German, we noticed what happens in 1989 when the wall came down. Plus, suddenly, all the people who had inherited land and houses in the previous German state of the GDR, they swam the GDR and were looking for their estates. So the question is very important. I mean, who takes on those empty buildings? the empty synagogues, the empty schools, and so forth. So the question of inheritance was a branding question after 135. Now, the Marcionite collection, when the Marcionite Paul, as well as the Marcionite Gospel, was absolutely clear. You can see it from the Gospel itself. You have even preserved in Luke. You have the benedictions. Yeah. So what do we inherit? Blessed are the poor, because what do they get? The kingdom of heaven. But then you can see the redactors. They place into Matthew a different blessing. They say, blessed are the poor because they inherit the land. And that's the debate until today in Gaza and Israel. Who owns the land? Who has got the promise of the land? Now, the Christians after 135 in the canonical redacted New Testament, they claim that the land belongs to the Christians. And you have that synoptic story about the winemakers, yeah, who is sending the sons. And because there's this complaint about the person who has rented out the vineyard.
Yeah.
He doesn't pay. And what happens? Christ is the stone on whom those people were crushing their heads. They're not only disinherited, they're killed. So it's a very drastic form of claiming what is one's own. Now, in Marcion's Gospel, but also in Marcion's Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:50, but also in Galatians 5:21, he says, flesh and bones cannot inherit anything. So what can inherit is the Spirit, and the Spirit only inherits things from the heaven. No earthly belongings. So there's, if you like to say, the message of the Marcionite New Testament is a very ascetic one, or a very spiritual one. Yeah, would fit brilliant to MythVision. Yeah, it is nothing tangible. It is only the spiritual things that count, and they're not counting in terms of money. They're counting in terms of spiritual weight. So only that. And if you want, it is a gospel or a New Testament against inheritance, which is, of course, a joke in a way, because testament means the will. If I write my testament, then either my kids get something or they don't, depending on my will.
Right.
Yeah. So here we have got the title, and that's why Marcion is the one who coined this title, if we follow Wolfram Kinsey's observations, and I think I have even added to those observations. Because whenever the term New Testament is being mentioned in the 2nd century, even in the early 3rd century, so including Irenaeus, including Tertullian and others, it solely means Marcion's New Testament. And it is a New Testament, so a new will. And if you like, it is almost like an anti-testament, because it doesn't give the people who read it any form of inheritance. It is a non-inheritance. You don't inherit Israel's synagogues. You don't inherit their buildings. You don't inherit their money. You don't inherit even their writings. And that's why he says our New Testament is the antithesis of the Old Testament. The Old Testament does not belong to Christians. It is a writing which belongs and remains with Jews. For us, the new Jews, the spiritual Jews, only spiritual things are being inherited.
If I may chime in, because this is really, really interesting. Man. So Marcion, I've heard it said that some think that Marcion could not have been part of the scribal activity behind Paul's letters, because they read Marcion as if he actually fundamentally disagrees with the theology of the Pauline letters that he has, the 10, not through and through, but his version of God, things like that, make them think that actually he didn't write these or wasn't part of the initial development of those 10 letters we call Paul in his collection. However, you keep bringing up stuff that makes me keep thinking about all of this stuff I've been learning over the years. Things like Romans 9 through 11, which you would say is canonical and is likely not original to Marcion. He gives this like cry at the beginning of Romans 9 of like, my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh, what I would do if you guys could just... But clearly there is a stumbling block. There is a blindness, a hardness that has come upon the Jews. And then he goes into explain using the analogy of scripture to say, you know, Pharaoh's eyes were closed, but it's all God's will. And then what happens? He then has to make a very interesting theological point, quote mining his Pesher style, if you will, whoever this author is, quote mine scripture to give reason for why the inheritance, which was meant in Romans 9 at the beginning, verse 5, for Israel. He now has to explain why this inheritance is now being grafted or given to Gentiles. But now if you factor in that this interpretation of inheritance isn't land necessarily, unless you're saying that canonical Christians in the name of Paul are saying actually, no, this land is Christian land and the Gentiles are fulfilling that. And it's not a spiritual thing. Is that what you're saying?
This is exactly what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay.
And
wow.
And you can see that those claims that Marcion could never have written those Pauline letters, this is absolutely true for the canonical stuff, right? The canonical 14 letters, he could never, ever. On the contrary, the redaction is done in light to counteract those 10 letters as they have been conceived or at least redacted by Marcion. So the Marcionite version coincides so much with his theology, with his inheritance views, with anything else. We can go through everything. That this is a form of Paul which has been either original, then he hasn't done anything to it, but then Paul is more than likely to be a pre-Marcion, yeah? Or rather what I believe is that Marcion picked two earlier collections of letters, the 3 letters and the 7 letters, yeah, and redacted them as good as he could in order that these letters give a form of belief and a form of views that coincided mostly, at least as much as he could, mostly with what he believed himself. And this is one of the reasons why Romans 9 to 11, there are probably 2 or 3 verses of these 3 chapters which remained or which were at the basis of these 3 chapters, which belong to Marcion's collection. The rest is added. And you can see what is being added, as Sanders says, doesn't make always really sense. Paul Sanders, who really admires Paul, writes this great book about Paul, but he says about the reasoning you've just given, right? This is the weakest part of Paul.
I didn't want to use those words, but
but he says so. He says it's miserable. Yeah. For example, this grammatical argument that he makes in those chapters where he says, "Oh, but God has said not to the plural in the plural sense of sons, but just to this son, to one semen he has given."
Oh, that's Galatians. Yeah.
Gosh, it's also in the Romans. Yeah.
It's hinted in Romans too. Yeah. So
it's just one, and that's why it's only Christ and not the Jews across the board.
Right.
I mean,
who can even the way he forces a strange argument to introduce the Gentiles here.
Yeah.
And then it's a weird ending that, like, there's been, like, I'm sure you know, there's like 4 or 5 interpretations where academics like, and then when the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, all Israel will be saved.
Yeah.
What does that even mean? And I tend to think whoever this redactor is has in mind, all right, once all the Gentiles are collected, whatever that number, we don't have a number, but it's imaginative by the author's hand that there's a certain amount of people, then those hard, stiff-necked, rebellious Jews who saw Christ as a stumbling block will then come to the realization of the truth at the very end.
Yeah,
It's kind of a reversal of the Hebrew Bible in a way, because the Hebrew Bible describes in the end, the nations will grab the coattails of Jews and they will say, hey, lead us to the holy mountain, teach us the law, teach us the ways. This flips it, and it has to then say, in the end, the Gentiles get their share, and then, well, we'll deal with you guys at the end. You're hard-headed and you aren't listening. Anyway, sorry.
Probably even Marcion has given a stepping stone for this kind of a reversal, because his Pauline idea is being that this Christ already now, has made Jews and Christians and pagans and everybody, right, one body right now.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons. I mean, he has this other marvelous example of the wineskins, and he says, well, one shouldn't pour new wine into old wineskins. So Christianity doesn't work within the wineskins of the Jews. It doesn't work. Despite the fact that I think he comes from a Jewish background himself, but he is a type of, as if Tertullian is right and Harnack too, then he comes from a proselyte background. So he must have made the experience that new ideas do not fit the old tradition, which goes against the grain of the time, where presbyteron, craton, the old things are better. That was the standard. But he goes against that. And that's why he calls the Testament a New Testament, a novel testament. But then the wineskins, he carries on. He says, but if you put new wine into new wineskins, both, he says, will be preserved. Which means the new wineskins and the new wine will be preserved. But the flip side is true too. The old wineskins with the old wine is also going to be preserved. So Israel isn't got to lose what it has. It has its scriptures, it has its cult, it has its everything, the tradition, and he does not claim what Israel possesses, which brings us from inheritance to possession. Marcion is anything but anti-Jewish, and he is certainly not a supersessionist. He does not believe that the Christians are removing from the Israelites what is the Israelites' possession. He claims that Christians have to build up something new and not get what they don't own. And only with people like Justin and then later Irenaeus, you get to this kind of an inheritance idea that Justin says, well, the Jews, they cannot even read their own language. They cannot even read their own texts. The only people who understand the Jewish writings are we Christians. And likewise, they don't own anything. What they own belongs to us. Their scriptures are ours, not theirs. And you can see that suddenly the Christians and the church becomes not only, let's say, a different cult, but a replacement cult.
Got it.
And that is what you find in the canonical New Testament.
Early heresiologists, they claimed, of course, Marcion was the first to introduce the New Testament and to compile the Pauline corpus. Do you agree? And of course, I know you do, but what does that mean for how we think about canon formation? I also want to add, to what extent did Marcion reshape the Pauline letters according to his theology? Asceticism, repudiation of slavery, affirmation of women, or was he simply preserving what he received?
No, I think in terms of asceticism, the reconstruction of his text of these 10 Pauline collection points me to the effect that he seems to have inherited a text which was even more ascetic than his own text. So I think our view is today is that we have a general early Christian community or movement which was very much like our Orthodox view today. Yeah, people married, people had whatever. But I think from the develop that becomes clear from the 10-letter collection is that the 10-letter collection is already a modifying even a moderation of an earlier, very ascetic early Christian beginnings, which I think can be easily understood if you think that in the beginnings, apparently, whenever that beginning was, but people were believing, like the Witnesses of Jehovah, that within this first generation, Christ would come again. The parousia would happen, and this world would disappear. Maybe that is a reminiscence of the First Jewish War. I don't know. But certainly people believe that it's no good marrying. And as a conciliatory act, Marcion introduces in those 10 letters of Paul that he creates the possibility not only to be celibate, but also to be married.
Right.
However, he says, and that is, I think, a takeover from an earlier, even more rigorous asceticism. He says, well, but if you are a Christian, and even if you are married, you have to renounce any sexual engagement, even in marriage. So there is no sexual relations in his Christian communities.
Wow.
Which of course I think was not the best recipe for a world religion, right? So
unrealistic, yeah.
Unrealistic, exactly. But attractive to many until today. I mean, we have ascetics in Christianity as we have them in most other religions. So there is an appeal to this type of rigorous following.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the Orthodox, I think, the Orthodox and the canonical redactors, they must have seen this kind of an unrealistic cult form. And I think that's one of the reasons why they flipped that element, and rewrite, for example, 1 Corinthians 7:1 by introducing a question from the Corinthians, which then the canonical Paul answers and says, oh, well, no, you can marry and that's all fine, that's, I mean, as long as it's for the offsprings. So that's the purpose. And you will find it then particularly in those forged letters, in the pastoral letters, that the bishop, the deacons, they're all married, and they live normal lives. And you have water and wine, and you have a normal lifestyle,
It's a good move toward normalizing and getting away from some ascetic apocalypticism.
Yeah.
How do we best read Tertullian's polemics when he quotes the same passages as both Paul and Marcion says? I almost want to be blunt and say, is this guy a liar in your view?
He's a rhetorician. He's like all our politicians, So don't take their word for it. You have to read in between the lines. If they say A, they mean B. If they say B, they mean A. It's not against the truth, but it's always sharply close to the truth. Most of the time, further away. In him distorting the picture by saying, well, this is Marcion. In fact, when you read Tertullian's commentary, throughout the text, he usually never calls it Marcion says. He always speaks of Paul is saying. So he admits that the Paul he's reading is the Paul. He then only adds and tries to reinterpret this Paul in light of the canonical Paul. So very rarely he says, oh, well, no, this Paul misses that verse and that verse. Most of the time he takes the text and he doesn't say, well, this is not what Paul says, but he says, well, no, but we have to read it in light of the prophets, in light of Genesis, in light of Leviticus, in light of whatever. So he comes to this Pauline collection, and you can see he's not a liar. He's not saying that's Marcion's words, but he says, well, we have to reinterpret. We can't take the interpretation that Marcion gives, but in effect, he admits that this collection is a serious collection. And how serious this collection is, you can see that before Irenaeus, nobody ever claims that this letter collection by Marcion is not Paul's letter collection. They all make use of Paul. Many make use of Paul. Polycarp makes use of Paul. One Clement makes use of Paul. Nobody of those people know of the collection. And if they do, they haven't got a sense of a distinct version. Irenaeus is the first to make that strong case that we have an abbreviator of Paul. But that's at the end of the 2nd century. So we have a long way to go until people start making these anti-heretical claims.
Wow, so much. You argue that the 14 letter collection and Acts together recast Paul into a very different figure, a solus Paul.
I say even Acts plus the Catholic epistles. This is so important because you can see in the section which the canonical redactors add to Marcion's 1 Corinthians 15, they add in 1 Corinthians 15:3 the appearances of the risen Christ. And here the Christ appears to these people who have written the Catholic letters. He first appears to Peter. Then he appears to the 12. Then he appears to James. Then he appears to hundreds of people. Yeah. So right at the end, Paul says of himself in this canonical Paul's voice, "Oh, I'm not worth it. Yeah, I'm the last one." And you can see it is a shaping of Paul in and through Acts, then through the Catholic epistles, and then through the 14 letter collection, which diminishes Paul's authority. I give you also one example. The 14 letter collection starts not with Galatians, but it starts with Romans. Why? Galatians, Marcion's first letter of Paul, he comes in with a big bang. He says, "I'm Paul, I am an apostle. Don't get me wrong. Not appointed by any human being. So not by the 12 or not by the 3, by nobody. Not by a human being, not through human beings, but by Christ, who rose himself." In the 14 letter collection, it starts with Paul, who has been called. Yeah. But then it is by Christ, not who raised himself, but by Christ, who is an offspring of David. Yeah. So right in the beginning, Romans places Paul next to others, and most particularly, he is called by a Christ who is part of the Jewish tradition, who is part of the prophetic tradition, and the Davidic Messiah. So it all links back right from the beginning that the canonical redactors do what they do in Acts, what they do in Romans 9 to 11, what they even do in Romans 15, 16. It is to create the impression that Christians are the heirs of Israel and that they are following a tradition, and that the Christian writings are nothing but an addition to the Ketuvim, to the writings of the Jews of the Old Testament. They're incorporated. And that's exactly what Marcion tried to reject.
So the Solus Paulus, you're saying, was a canonical formation that is, in a sense, Judaizing the cult in some way. And not that they're going, you know what I mean? Like,
I would say anti-Judaism then. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Judaizing in the sense, you are right. Yeah. That the whole baggage and the tradition of the Jews are taking over, but only, of course, through the lenses of the Christians. And then by recasting, and you see, they do the same thing as Hadrian does. When Hadrian dismisses all the circumcised Jews from Jerusalem, these canonical redactors do exactly the same. They follow Hadrian's path by cutting out the Jewish tradition, by taking on those elements like the prophets who speak about Christ, like the Torah, insofar as they can deal with it. Yeah. But the rest, the life of Jews, that's being dismissed.
Thank you for the gifted 5, Daniel Kyle, for being a member and for giving 5 new memberships to random viewers here. I don't know if you picked them already, but thank you so much for helping grow the team. Jada, thank you for that super chat, my friend. Doc Pluralmanot's got a question. Daniel Kyle's got a question. We're going to get to these questions here soon.
Of course,
so just
please do.
Bear with me here. We're going to get to them. But again, as you argue, the 14-letter collection acts together recast Paul into a very different figure, a Saulus Paulus. What would you say was gained by this transformation, and what was lost?
I think what was lost is easier than what was gained. What was lost, of course, was a religion that was a religion of the spirit. It was also lost that it was a religion where women had a central place. Because in Marcion's communities, as Tertullian mocks him about, the women were called the most and the more holy person. And you can see it throughout. When you read, for example, 1 Corinthians 14, Marcion makes or gives 2 examples of things which in his community should no longer take place compared to what the Torah and the prophets say. First of all, speaking in tongues. The people who might love speaking in tongues will be disappointed, but in the earlier Paul that we reconstructed here, you can see that Paul admits speaking in tongues for the private sector, so for the house. But he says in the community, speaking of tongues is nonsensical. It's like playing a guitar without notes. It's like singing something which people hate or people don't understand. It's like talking here on the channel. When I now start talking in tongues, everybody can get away with whatever they want, but there is no sense behind it unless there's a translator. And this is already a concession that the canonical redactors take in. And the canonical redactors make Paul himself somebody who speaks in tongues, which is unknown in Marcion's collection. So speaking in tongues in the community is out. But more importantly, the saying taken from the prophets that, or from the Torah, as he claims, that women should shut up in the community and should obey to their husbands when they want to learn something. That is a serious topic which Marcion denies in the future to Christians. That's something, he says, which can stay with Torah and with Jews in their communities, but which is no longer valued in our community. Now, the canonical redactors, they take out these 2 verses and place them in different places. In 5 of our 800 manuscripts in Paul, they stick it, and I think that's the first move, they cut it out and stick it at the end of chapter 14. And suddenly, it becomes a rule for Christians that women have to abandon the public speech, despite the fact that in chapter 11, they are prophesying. But now, in those 5 manuscripts, we have it that women have to shut up in the community. They are silenced.
Which is a red flag. I mean, it's more likely you have 2 voices from different groups, clearly, or somehow. And
you can see it in these 995 other manuscripts of Paul. The 2 verses are put into where the places where we have it in the Nestle Aland in our modern editions as verses 34 and 35 in the chapter 14. But in Marcion's Pauline text, it was entered after 1421. And here it has the opposite meaning. So you can see how the redaction have lost the voice of female people in the community. So no longer preaching, no longer prophesying, and a subjugation of women to men. That's, Vance would say, that's the gain. I would say that's what we lost. Wow. Now, what we gained is people like Vance would say, and Trump would say, oh, fantastic. Only men, big men, smart men are making Christianity. Women have no say in Christians, at least not in the public. More gains, of course, these Christian communities that have taken on board all the property and all the inheritance, they became a much stronger, financially more viable community. And you can also see that the Paul of Acts becomes no longer an intellectual. Yes, he preaches here and there, but he becomes a money maker. He becomes a big organizer. Chapters 8 and 9 of 2 Corinthians are nothing but two big chapters, how to make money. It is the collection for Jerusalem. And you can see it recurs in Acts. It comes back in Romans 16. It comes back in 1 Corinthians 16. It becomes the important thing. Titus himself becomes the one who is looking after that collection. He overbrings the collection to Jerusalem. People have said, scholars, that Paul is an organizer who has no parallel in the first century. This type of a money-making organization didn't exist. The Jews, the Tannaeans, they have somehow mirrored Paul only in the end of the 2nd century, which of course is a circular argument which works against itself. Because in fact, what the reality, I think, the historical reality was that people who redacted Acts or have written Acts in around 160, maybe 165, they knew about the Jewish Tannaeans. They knew about those money collections that took place because they have lost the Jewish fiscus and the Jewish tax, which was settled by the Romans after the First Jewish War, into the communal tax office in Rome. So they had to gain money. And they did it at the end of the 2nd century. And I think that's exactly the same time when Acts adopts this idea from the Jewish Tannaeans and makes Paul the organizer, who no longer writes letters, but he organizes the finance. And also makes him subjugate himself to the community in Jerusalem. So you can see how the redaction has remodeled the picture of Paul, making him from a spiritual writer who has written texts which are more school-like literature, almost philosophical literature. And what we end up with are a 14-letter collection, which sounds more like a moral teaching, like homilies, which are being put out, extensive moral exhortations, advice against homosexuality, which has no place in Marcion's collection, suddenly comes in, and so forth. And there are good historical reasons why they were doing it, yeah. But it is an adaptation of Christianity which fits the post-Second Jewish War, or rather the late 2nd century. That's when Christianity settles down. And of course, with those powers, political powers and also financial powers, the bishop, for example, in Rome is a banker. So that's how important money becomes. And that's the settlement of Christianity. And without that settlement, I think it had never, ever made its way into the Roman Empire, let alone it would have never, ever become a world religion.
You may have kind of answered this one already, but who do you think stands behind the Paul of the 10-letter collection? Can we identify editorial hands or schools shaping this figure?
Yeah, we can. That's the interesting thing. It's long been seen that Irenaeus plays a key role. But then Irenaeus is only one figure, as he himself claims and shows in letters and also in his work, because he is a heir of the school of Polycarp. Now, Polycarp must have been an important teacher in the mid-2nd century. He was teaching, according to Irenaeus, in the empire's basilica in Ephesus. Now, if you and me become a job to preach in Trump's basilica, if you ever wanted that, I mean, I probably wouldn't, but you must have had some standing, financial standing, political standing. You have to be a very known figure, and you have to, let's say, be a moderate who works with the empire. Otherwise, you would not be allowed to have a public speech, let alone to carry out your school, not in the bath like Justin Martyr in Rome, on the second floor, but in the emperor's basilica in Ephesus. And that's what he does. So he must have been let's say, a collaborator with the Romans. And then you're not surprised that the type of Christianity that he creates and is being created in his school, right, adopts this type of a style where you find in Romans 13, 1-7, that we should obey to the government and should pray for them. That's
and pay taxes.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Now, we have a letter of Polycarp. Oh, unfortunately, only one letter that is attributed to him. And when you see the opening of that letter, it is word by word identical to the first letter credited to Clement. Now, you can see Polycarp would never, I think, have copied a letter by somebody else. With his standing, almost impossible. So 1 Clement can only be part of the school work that's being produced in Polycarp's school. He comes from Smyrna, but he teaches in Ephesus. So he's in Asia Minor, in the capital city of Asia Minor. Mm-hmm. And when you then read his letter, it reads like a piece which is being cut out, or like a puzzle, with pieces from all 27 writings which end up in our canonical New Testament. So here you find he quotes 4 texts by Paul. That's the only text that he literally quotes. The first one that he quotes comes from a Deutero-Pauline writing, not from Paul. The second quote, which he says, Paul, the blessed one, says, mm-hmm. or a dotes hoti, you know, this text comes from a pseudo, from one of the forged 4 letters. And the next 2 come from 2 Pauline verses, which you only will find in the non-Marcionite, only in the redacted form. So what we've got here is a first attempt with this letter to make a case for an alternative New Testament, namely for the canonical New Testament.
What year is that?
That is in the 160s. Yeah, he must have no longer been a teacher, because it's a letter where he presents himself as a presbyter. So he's a community leader in the meantime. It is that he has been martyred. That's at least what Eusebius gives us in the year 167, maybe 168, in the times of Mark Aurel, the emperor.
Gotcha.
So his letter comes late, let's say sometime in the 160s. And hence, Irenaeus writes just a few years later his Against the Heresies, where he exactly makes use of all these writings. If we extract what he presents us in the books 3-5, we can see that he alludes to or quotes from these 27 books that we have in the New Testament from about 22. But the 27 you will find already in Polycarp's letter to the Philippians. So you will have references to Acts, you will have references to Revelation, to 1st and 2nd Peter, to 1-3 John even to Jude, there is a hint. So what we've got is we can identify, I think, the community and the school where our canonical New Testament has been produced. And that's not a surprise that then the first propagator of the New Testament with the 4 Gospels and those writings is Irenaeus. And the very first quotes that he presents us in Adversus Hereses and against the heresies are 2 quotes, just like his teacher, who do not derive from the 7 authentic or quote authentic Pauline letters, but from the Deutero and the pseudo-Pauline texts.
With Paul, just so we're on the same page, you just described the canonical school, but is it more of a mystery in your view trying to solve the 10-letter collection that Marcion has and who crafted these? Because my next question, keep that one in mind, I'm sure you can juggle this, is given your research, is there any hope of recovering a historical Paul? Or are we always dealing with a literary Paul preserved only in collected form? So it's like, who wrote it? What is the school behind the original? If we're granting these 10 or earlier, which it seems they are, then who's behind that school? Who wrote these letters saying they're Paul? Do you think this goes back to a Paul? Can we ever recover a guy named Paul? Is there a historical Paul? Is there not a historical? You see what I'm doing? Of
course. I mean, this is the first question usually I'm always asked.
I saved it best for last. No, I'm just kidding.
What I discovered in doing, together with the team, in doing this reconstruction was that the 10 letters go back themselves to already 2 earlier existing collections. One collection consists of 7 letters, and it's not by surprise that these are the 7 letters that modern scholarship credits as the authentic ones. However, in a different shape and form, smaller, shorter, as we have them in this collection of Marcion. Now, he draws already on an earlier collection of those 7 letters. That has become clear because we have this back reference in his collection, in Marcion's. In Galatians 5:21, he says, "As I have said before." And what follows then, he has mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. So 1 Corinthians is behind Galatians in his collection. That he refers to an earlier text, which comes later, he must have had a collection where 1 Corinthians was earlier than Galatians, on which he draws. Yeah, it's a typical mistake of an editor. So he draws on a collection of 7 letters. And he also draws on a collection of 3. And that's why these other 3, which today we call Deuteropaulines, these other 3 were embedded in his 10 letters in one close compound. And so we can see those 2 collections which go further back in history. Now, but your question is, of course, is the 3 letters collection or the 7 letters collection probably going back to Paul? I can tell you the 3 letters, they certainly go back to Polycarp's school because they have all the language and most of the ideas which we find in precisely those parts which are added to the 7 letters.
So I want to follow where you're going here.
Yeah.
The 10 letters that we have in Marcion school, which predate the 14-letter canonical versions, those 10 letters, which, by the way, are reduced in size as well from the canonical, they're already doing a game in a way, too, in a sense. Same game that the later 14 letters were doing by adding 3 additional letters to their corpus from a potentially earlier based on just modern reconstruction. Do we have any ancient voice that hints at there being, like you said, there's a Polycarp school with 3 letters. Is there any school that you would attribute the 7 to? I mean, or do you not have that information?
That's the more interesting one, right? We don't have a school so far. I think that's one of the next steps to do research, right? Is can we single out that there is a milieu, there is a school, there is potentially whatever, where these 7 letters come from? So we can identify the 3, but we can't identify at the moment the 7. And it would be of interest, of course, whether those 7 letters in the earlier shape and form could go back to a whatever historical person which we may credit with the name of Paul. So that's certainly a step to go. But I think we're not yet in a position. We might do a show in a year's time and know more. Yeah. But at the moment, I would say Nina's insight that almost all letter collections that we know of, with a few exceptions like Cicero's letters, yeah, but most of the collections were, in contrast to Cicero's letters, where we only have 1 or 2 letters to one addressee.
Mm-hmm.
So very few letters. All of those collections we have are pseudonymous, are fictive collections. She gives a few examples. I give you just the most famous one, the letters of Plato. So every great person are given letters in a letter collection. And modern scholars believe, and I just had a good discussion with a specialist, a classical philologist, who is a specialist on Plato's letters.
Right.
And he admits in public, yeah, he gave a speech about, it was a colloquium on 1 and 2 Corinthians in Leuven. And he talked about Plato's letter collection as a comparison. But then he ended up by saying, no, even letter number 8 and 7, which are the most biographically loaded letters of Plato, scholarship today holds they're all fictive. It's a fictional collection.
Would it be safe to say you would say, sure, it might be noble to look for the historical Paul, but we're likely wasting our time, though?
No, not necessarily. Look,
no.
To create a fictional letter collection like the letters of Plato are usually given to a very important person.
Gotcha.
So you don't pick from the air a name and then you create a letter collection for this fictive name. To have a collection, even if it is not written by the person itself, embeds ideas from that person. When you read the Plato's letters, I mean, there are so many reminiscences to his teaching, which we get from the dialogues. So even if the letters are not written by him, it is the attempt, at least, of the people who wrote these letters to capture something of his life and to capture something of his thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I would say we have a similar and a parallel case to the Ignatian letters. Although I still believe that most of these letters, we have first a 3-letter collection, later a 7-letter collection. I mean, the 4 additional letters, here also 4 new letters, are certainly forged. Yeah, from the 3 letters, Jack Bull, my former student, he wants me to believe, and I can follow him, yeah, that maybe the letter to the Romans or the letter to Polycarp, so one of the 2, might be letters which go back to a historical martyr of Ignatius from the beginning of the 2nd century. Again, one would hardly think that you pick from the air a name, even if it's a martyr, and then create a letter collection to a fictive person. This is possible, but unlikely.
This is your fundamental difference between Nina and you. Is Nina at least is she's hypothesizing for the viewer who hasn't read it or doesn't know. Nina Livesey, she has a really interesting hypothesis. I've learned greatly from her work, but she looks back to Acts and says, look, this story was so powerful. Of course, she has a different chronology, I imagine, than you do as well.
Not too much. We both think of the 2nd century.
Got you. Yeah. I'm just saying Acts, the role of Acts on any Pauline letters.
Yeah.
And the fact that you have this famous character from Saul to Paul was enough to get people to go, this is our hero. And so there are these fictional letters in the name of a fictional character, which they may have read by the time the letters are there or understood by the time the letters are being written as a real guy, a real hero in the early church. But what's more likely? And so again, we come back to your point of actually it's more common to take a real dude and create writings in the name of and pretend you're writing. Right. Yeah,
I would have thought, because look, these people are like you and me. They're pragmatists, right? So the easier way is the more common one, I would say. Yeah. And the easier thing is you have a character and then you create something which is suitable for this character, rather than, I mean, how many Shakespeares are there born in 5,000 years? Yeah, pretty few.
Right.
So I rather think they are mediocre like us. They pick what they know, what they get to know, yeah, and then they construct something on the basis of that. So that's the easier way. And I would always think history and historical explanations should go for the easier solution.
Thank you so much.
Different.
Yeah. And again, thank you for like taking this time. Jack almost joined us today. Special shout out. We're going to get to super chats just a second. To you, Markus Vinzent, when this book's out, let me know. I'll put the link in the description. He's got a YouTube channel as well. Patristica. Make sure you subscribe. Jack Poole, Markus Vinzent, Mark G. Bilby, and then the fourth academic, Lance. Yes. What's his last name again? I have it.
Lotharp.
Yes. So stay tuned. Brilliant minds behind this. I can't recommend the Orestes writing that I recently came across with Bilby. I mean, that really just gets you thinking. Okay. I love that stuff. You know me, I'm a myth guy anyway. So anything that's harking back to mythology or these kinds of things is just fascinating. Again, shout out to Joda. Thank you for the super. Doc Pluromana, Lex Porcia or Porcia, made rod flogging a Roman citizen illegal, yet Paul boasts of it. 2 Corinthians 11:25. While Acts insists he's a citizen. Isn't this legal dissonance proof of two Pauls, Acts inventing the latter?
I fully agree with you. I mean, we have quite a number of inconsistencies which you find in either in the Lucan redaction or, as you have it here, in Acts. It's quite interesting when you, for example, read Bouvon, François Bouvon, a Swiss scholar who has written a large commentary in several volumes on Luke. He says where we have the story with Pontius Pilate in the 15th year of Tiberius, the beginning of chapter 3, he says, well, after Pontius Pilate, what comes then is historical fiction. And is it a surprise that exactly where Marcion's gospel breaks off and has no text, the canonical text is what Bouvon calls historical fiction? And that's the same thing as here. So unfortunately, we have those historical redactors of the late 2nd century that want to make claims about the 1st century and get it so often wrong.
Thank you, Doc. I love you, man. Thank you for the super chat. Daniel Kyle handing out free salvation. Wow, free salvation. Now, it cost him. It wasn't free for him, but he's giving away free salvation. You better take
Great
it up.
Support, yeah.
Yeah, seriously. Love you, Daniel. And Daniel has a super chat. So thank you so much. Do you feel like Paul had an authentic relationship with the James Church? How much of the apostles' hierarchy is true? Did they even exist?
In Paul's time, I don't think they existed in that sense as we have them later in the canonical version. Having said that, even the 10-letter collection knows of James and seems to have a kind of a relation, but the relation went not very well. Because when the difference between the canonical version of Galatians 1 and 2 and the 10-letter collection that we have reconstructed is that the row between Peter and Paul doesn't take place in Antioch, but takes place right in the first meeting in Jerusalem. And so I think the attempt to move this away from Jerusalem, place it in a separate entity in Antioch, have only brothers coming along from James to see and disturb the relation between Paul and Peter, is an attempt of the canonical redactors to reduce the deep dissonance that existed between Paul, Peter and James and John in Jerusalem. And I think the second attempt to overcome this kind of a dissent, which must have run through very deeply in the beginning, if that was historical, but at least that's the portrait we get from the 10-letter collection, is the collection for Jerusalem. Whereas Galatians 2 in the 10-letter collection states that it is the task for all four, Paul and the other three, to look for the poor. The canonical redactors read that differently, so that it is only Paul's job to look for the poor, by which then is meant the people in Jerusalem. So you can see that from a task that was set for all, namely to look after the poor people, comes a job which is now linked to Paul to satisfy Jerusalem. So you can see how the redactors have worked. And I think there might have been an authentic relation, at least authentic in the sense of what we can draw from the 10-letter collection, but it was not a healthy one. It was a very difficult one.
Thank you so much for that, Daniel. Appreciate your answer. Doc Pleromanot again. Barnabas is called an apostle in Galatians 2, even outranking Paul, yet Acts rewrites him as junior partner. Isn't this Polycarp Irenaeus redaction erasing Barnabas to craft a safer Catholic Paul?
Indeed. And you can see between and with this kind of an inconsistency, both on the canonical level. That is why I believe, together with the team, and I think we can establish even pretty securely, that we have not only to deal with one canonical redaction, but actually with two. We have a first redaction, like in Galatians 2, where Barnabas is being placed to outrank Paul. Yeah. And we have another one in Acts, which is then even further diminishing people like Barnabas now. They get an entire life story in Acts. And we can see how these different redactions sometimes contradict each other. So I guess, no, it's not a guess. I think it is based on the data we have. It's that in the first redaction, which must have been taken place early after the Second Jewish War, we have the 7 plus the 3 letters, which are first of all redacted by Marcion. So this forms the 10-letter collection. But then the 10-letter collection must have gone back to the canonical editors, to the people where Marcion got his 3 letters from. And that's why these 3 letters are only slightly reworked by the canonical editors, because it was their original text anyway. But the 7 letters, they get a substantial reduction already. So like chapters 9 to 11 are added, chapter 4 is added, chapter 6 in Romans. So 5 big chapters in Romans have been edited and added to Romans. Not yet chapters 15 and 16, because nobody before Irenaeus and Polycarp know about these chapters. So we have this kind of a first canonical redaction of Paul. At the same time, Marcion's gospel is being redacted and ends up with 4 different versions, the one we later know as canonical gospels. Only the 10 letters were together, because that was the remake of the 10-letter collection of Marcion, in a canonical version. But the 4 gospels apparently have not been in a compound collection, because even people like Justin don't know of a don't know of a gospel collection. Nobody knows of a gospel collection until Irenaeus. Mm-hmm. So we have a first, let's say, canonical redaction shortly after the Jewish War, to which then also Marcion reacts and puts his collection as a New Testament together. And that he does that against the canonical redactors, I think, creates the reason why then Polycarp's school, together with Irenaeus, come up and also create a compound collection of Gospels, of Acts, of all these letters, and of Revelation. And that collection, only with Origen, transfers the name of New Testament to that new collection. So it takes almost 100 years.
Thank you so much for those super chat questions. Some interesting answers too. Look, Dr. Vinzent, you are a new, refreshing voice with different ideas that are really, really I love that we have that diversity to be able to hear these different kind of observations on how we approach the New Testament material, early church material. Yeah, and you're pushing the limits, right? So you guys are doing some cutting edge stuff. I really hope that people will go and subscribe to your YouTube channel. So you want to watch more videos. The scholarly trio often you will find over there at the YouTube channel. So make sure you go check that out. You guys are interviewing scholars yourself and going deeper into this material as well. You have several books on Amazon. People can go check those books out. Link is in the description where you can access all his books. Also, he has the blog and academia. So YouTube, Amazon, go check out his books, blog, academia, which also has articles he's written. Download them for free. Any final words from you as we wrap up this session?
Yeah, just double my numbers of followers on academia, because I've got 50,000. A few more would be nice. No, that was a joke. No, engaging with serious scholarship. We, as Derek has said, we are going to publish this 1 volume in English next year. But at the end of this month, which is pretty soon, we will have 3 more volumes, and this is the textual reconstruction with an introduction of about 850 pages, which is going to be published. And as we speak, we are translating at the moment these 3 volumes, so that these 3 volumes with the introduction, which is then a scholarly introduction, together with the reconstructed Greek text and an English translation, is going to be published also next year with Peters in Leuven. But wow. Mark Bilby has now put together, and Derek will be able to put it into the subscription here, already a forerunner. So we will publish with Mark as the main editor this time, and the rest are the minor ones. The English translation of the reconstructed 10-letter collection of the Apostles of Paul. I think in the next days, probably next week or the week after, you will be able to download on Amazon and wherever. You can buy the book, and you can see with your own hands, with a short introduction, those 10 letters as we have seriously reconstructed these texts. So you can make up your own mind. You can compare it to the canonical Paul, which is also part of that publication. So you really have in hands the texts themselves, and you can see what canonical redactors have done to the text. Or you can be of the opinion, no, it's Marcion who has cut down on this text. But I think I give you an example. Jan Bremer, one of the leading scholars on religious studies, once he has read the 2 texts side by side, he sent me an email back and said, Markus, I now believe this Paul is the earlier Paul.
He's brilliant, by the way. I use him all the time. I love his work. I mean, I love all you guys' works. I mean, look, I just want more and more people to come across considering what you're putting out here. And again, do you go in this next book, the brief introduction, explaining how you've determined? Yeah, I mean, precisely. Without getting into every nut and bolt.
But no. Here it's a short way. So it's really a book written for non-specialists, and you always have to do the breadth, right? So the 3 books, reconstruction, are for scholars. The 1 book can be read by any non-specialist, but then we have the reduced version for those people who don't have too much time and would like to have an insight in these very important texts.
Yeah, because in my mind, I'm going to want to read the truncated version. We'll need to do a follow-up episode on this and dive into the generic, easy to understand version. But for me, I would seriously, without knowing the languages, I haven't got the languages under my belt. And eventually, when I hopefully get some of the languages under my belt, we can get even deeper in the weeds. But this I would be,
This is plain English. So
yeah. I'm just thinking in my head, even as even as someone who doesn't know the languages, I would still then go, how did you determine this? What makes this, and stuff. So I have all these questions.
Fantastic.
Yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. Again, let's do this again.
As always.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, get the books, subscribe to their YouTube channel, and never, ever, ever, ever forget, we are MythVision.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland, and I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.